6.4, the last section of Unit 6, and something kind of disconnected from the rest of the Enlightenment, but very topical in terms of time period, because the Enlightenment is 18th century, and it isn't, it is a intellectual movement. So we've got to understand what else is happening in Europe economically and politically, because that's somewhat disconnected from the Enlightenment. So it's important for us to know, well, while everybody is thinking of new ideas, what's really happening. And it's a continuation of a lot of the things that we've studied starting with Unit 3. So the menu here, we're looking at the characteristics of the Atlantic-based economy with triangular trade, the Atlantic slave trade, role of mercantilism. Again, a lot of this is going to be reviewed. And then how do those commercial rivalries create foreign policy or political conflicts between the closer here, get up in your business. That was embarrassing. I apologize. All right, so first of all, transatlantic triangle trade. Again, this system is set up in the 16th century, in the 1500s, shortly after Columbus discovers the New World. But it assumes that there are things in the New World that the European economies could develop into a profitable product. And we've talked a lot about the Columbian Exchange and how goods can go from one place to another. Certainly like corn and potatoes, the impact they have on people's diet. But really you're looking at not only that, but also things like coffee, which turns into the coffee houses, tobacco, which is a consumer product. All of these things can be developed in your colonies and brought back to home, or to, in this case, Europe, to develop into your economy. So this is mercantilism, right? Your colonies do the work for you. You bring it back. You develop your own economy, and you compete against everybody else for who has the most wealth, which equals in the most power. So even though we talked about Adam Smith and kind of his different ideas on economic trade, the physiocrats, and how they saw wealth or land at least a little bit differently, that's not going to make much of a difference in terms of who's pulling the strings here in these Atlantic-based countries. They're still going to be directing much of what they do by the principles of mercantilism, which says you make your own stuff, your colonies pull their weight, and then you get wealthy and compete with everybody else. Now, the backbone of that success, unfortunately, of course, was the development of the slave trade. And over the course of 200 years, and that's even excluding the 150 before, 10 to 15 million Africans sent to not only North America, but much more significantly into South America. You actually had the largest amount of Africans that were sent to Brazil in the sugar trade. So look at all of those goods, as it tells you there, that key, which are brought back to Europe to develop your consumer culture. Tobacco, coffee, cotton, sugar, rice to a degree, mining for precious metals. All those things are transferred over to Europe at the top of your screen up there to help develop their consumer culture. It doesn't happen without the growth of the slave trade. And of course, you know the Middle Passage. You've seen depictions of that. You've seen movies depicting it. So, how do we justify Enlightenment philosophy with 18th century economics? How do we justify the equality of men, if that is to include all races and all socioeconomic levels? How do we justify that with this development of the slave trade? So these are questions and topics which hit the founding fathers of our country. How do we justify economic prosperity with Enlightenment philosophy? It's a difficult thing to consider. It's going to cause certainly many conflicts down the road. Another consequence from the development of the slave trade is the increase of the food supply throughout Europe. So corn, potatoes, all of these things that are grown in great length in the New World, of course, those are planted in the New World and sent, but they're also sent over to Europe too. But anyway, those goods and those products help develop and grow the food supply throughout Europe. So as we kind of look at the question now of how does the economics impact the political situation? Well, here's what we've got in, I'd say, the mid-1700s in terms of an economic look at colonies across the world and where goods are moving back and forth. And it shows you, especially in the New World, that you've got a lot of countries busting at the seams in terms of where they're growing. And eventually you're going to have conflict because certain countries, you would think, will come in conflict with one another based on the land they have. And then, even potentially more significantly, as I get out my handy-dandy pen, what's going to happen in this side of the world, right here? All these trade routes. Ooh. Which have, it's not like you have like one road per country. These trade routes are being used by multiple countries. So what's going to happen when those routes come into conflict with one another? Are these countries going to just say, oh, cheerio, mate, sorry? I sound like Shrek on that one. Are they going to basically say, hey, you just come this way, I'll go this way? No, these countries are going to conflict and they're going to battle and they're going to butt heads based on these trade routes. So that's where economic success is going to lead to more political problems. And that's kind of the legacy of mercantilism, is that, yeah, it brings incredible wealth to Europe, but it also brings a lot of conflict because it's the assumption that no two countries can work together. You either get it or I get it. And whoever doesn't get it, in terms of the resources, the wealth, is the loser. So it does lead to a lot of conflict. So these rivalries over commercial trade routes, commercial successes, it leads to warfare throughout the 18th century. Remember, back in the 17th, 16th century, we were fighting for religious purposes. No more. Now it's all these mercantile wars of countries butting heads. Probably my favorite story is this War of Jenkins' Ear, which is sometime around the 1740s. But it involves Spain and England, and an English boat was, a shipping boat is traveling on the Atlantic, and it is run down by Spanish merchant marines. So they run this ship down because they're apparently like trading on the Spanish route or whatever. And the Spanish guard load this boat, and there's get into a scuffle, and the Spanish soldier gets his sword out and cuts the ear off of this guy named Jenkins. Old man Jenkins, right? That ear, look, it's gone. You don't see it anymore. See that it's disappeared. I don't know. But anyway, it's a war over trade disputes. And it was a very minor war, and I think England won. No one cared. But it does set the scene, and it sets the tone that these countries are ready to fight over their colonies. And that's something that we're going to see more and more of. And probably the best example of this is the 7 Years' War. Now, you know the 7 Years' War from a different context. It's the French and Indian War. It's the same conflict. This is actually World War I in many ways, because you have fighting in the colonies between England and France, and then on the continent, you have fighting between Austria and Prussia. And I believe at this point, France and Austria, were traditional enemies, have actually linked hands together and are fighting together, and the same with England and Prussia. And I think Russia jumps in a little bit, but not as much. So throughout the course of this fighting, you know who wins in the New World. And in Europe, you see Prussia with Frederick the Great battling Austria and Maria Theresa. They were not friends. Know that for the salon. Frederick the Great, Maria Theresa, not so much. But in any case, this war ends, and it's clear after it's over that England and Prussia come out the winners at what was called the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And with this treaty, we can identify now England as the continental superpower after taking French colonial lands. Ironically, of course, England is not on the continent of Europe, but if we had the power rank at this point after the Treaty of Paris, we would probably put England at the top spot. They take all of France's colonial lands, and again, what we know about mercantilism says, if you don't have colonies, you're in trouble, and France loses much of their colonies, at least on the North American continent. Okay, so England comes out strong, Prussia comes out strong, Austria and France kind of hurting. France and Austria actually hurting so much that they see each other as maybe partners to try to have success later. So a diplomatic marriage is ordered between the grandson, and thus the heir to the throne of France, who will become Louis XVI, and the daughter of Maria Theresa in Austria, her name Marie Antoinette. If you've ever heard of her, we'll talk about her soon. But those two get married in France and Austria, form kind of an alliance out of that. Look, I can tell the future. So there you go. those marriages result from that alliance. But again, the big point, the economics of the period helps trigger political problems and political conflict between countries fighting over land. But understand the context of the economics and how just because Adam Smith says, hey, free trade, working together, doesn't mean countries will start doing that until later. So again, colonies are important. Mercantilism matters. It develops the slave trade. It develops triangular trade, and that leads to a consumer culture in Europe. It leads to an increase of the food supply. But how does it jive with Enlightenment philosophy? Things to think about. So that's the end of 6.4. Again, not as much on the Enlightenment, but its connection to the Enlightenment and the problems that the countries following mercantilism will have when comparing it to Enlightenment philosophy. It's kind of a later question, but it's something I think I can bring up. So, again, Enlightenment, huge unit. Make sure and go back and review Enlightenment ideas. Make sure and understand where do you see the Enlightenment in economics, religion, arts. Make sure and understand how certain absolute monarchs say, you know what, I'm going to try this idea out, but also understand the economics of the period and how it develops from exploration and how it will become questioned by the Enlightenment. I think that's all. I didn't mean to pull that up. Okay, that's it. We'll see you in France for the next unit. You're going to start to see a lot of people that look like this. Not going to tell you what's going to happen. Wait, there we go. I didn't want my hair is still popping out of there. But you're going to see a lot of bloody stumps of heads here soon. Okay, I don't know where the button is, so I'm going to have to reattach my head. And I'll stop it here. Okay.